Okay. Okay. Okay, great. On behalf of POMED, I would like to welcome you to this panel, which we've entitled Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia, A Deeper Look. I want to thank all of you who were able to make it in this weather. Unfortunately, we had to move to the smaller venue because SEIU, the original venue, was closed today with the federal government closing. But we decided to move forward with the event because we have two speakers from out of town, and we weren't confident that we would be able to bring them together in the short term. We may or may not have enough food for everyone, so we apologize for that inconvenience and also for the somewhat cramped space. On the positive side, we are live streaming this event, so folks will be able to watch directly on their screens, and there will be a recording as well, which people can watch after the event has concluded at their own convenience. I want to thank the panelists for making it in under these circumstances. I'm really excited to have this excellent group of speakers and experts to comment on what's taking place. As the title of this event indicates, we're here to take a deeper look at Mohammed bin Salman and his impact on Saudi Arabia. The young prince's first trip to Washington since supplanting Mohammed bin Naif as crown prince presents a logical opportunity to take stock of his performance to date and to consider the likely trajectory of the kingdom under his leadership. Mohammed bin Salman's record is fairly complex, and partly as a result, he has both devoted advocates and energetic detractors. On the one hand, he's been heralded as a great reformer in some circles for his vision of modernizing aspects of religious, social, and economic life in the kingdom. His efforts to loosen restrictions on Saudi women in particular have won particular acclaim. However, as the Washington Post stated in an editorial, the problem is that the Crown Prince's liberalizing steps have been accompanied by even bolder acts of repression. And there's perhaps no better illustration of this than of his penchant for extra-legal action than the detention of hundreds of individuals at the Ritz-Carlton for alleged corruption. Additionally, Mohammed bin Salman's economic and foreign policies have been the subject of much debate, with people chiming in on both sides, positive and negative. But what's important to understand is that the overall story that emerges from Mohammed bin Salman's varied actions defies easy characterization and thus requires an in-depth and nuanced study. It is for this purpose that we've assembled this panel, which will peer beneath the top-line narratives and attempt to decipher what is actually happening in Saudi Arabia and what it means for the kingdom, the region, and for the United States. Before introducing the speakers, just a brief note of the format. I'm going to ask each of the speakers a question or series of questions to which they will have 6 to 7 minutes to respond. And after perhaps asking a few follow-up questions, we can then open it up to the floor for their questions and also solicit questions online for people who are watching through the live stream. Again, very excited to have this panel, and let me briefly introduce them before we move into their commentary. First, we have Jamal Khashoggi, who's an independent Saudi writer and Washington Post contributor based in Washington, D.C. He previously worked for a number of Middle East-based networks, including the Saudi Gazette and the Sharq al-Awsat. He was forced to leave Saudi Arabia in 2017. We also have Tamara Cofman Wittes, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings. Tamara served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from November of 2009 to January 2012, coordinating U.S. policy on democracy and human rights in the Middle East during the Arab uprisings. Her current research is for a forthcoming book, Our SOBs, on the tangled history of America's ties to autocratic allies. We also have Hala Aldosari, who is a Saudi human rights activist, scholar, and writer currently based at Harvard University's Radcliffe Institute. Her work focuses on the social determinants of health and gender-based violence in the Gulf states. She is a recipient of the Freedom Award from Freedom House in 2016 and the Alison Des Forges Award for Extraordinary Activism from Human Rights Watch in 2018. And finally, we have Kristian Ulrichsen, who is a Baker Institute Fellow for the Middle East at Rice University. His research focuses on the changing position of Persian Gulf states in the global order, as well as the emergence of longer-term non-military challenges to regional security. So again, thank you, panelists, for coming, and in particular, thanks for coming in under this inclement weather. But with that, let's get into a discussion of the events. As I said, I will ask each of you a question or a few questions, and if you will take 6 to 7 minutes to provide an initial response, and we can move on from there. So we're going to start with Jamal. So Jamal, I'd like you to consider these questions. What is Mohammed bin Salman's vision for Saudi Arabia? What motivates him? What effect has Mohammed bin Salman had on universal freedoms in the kingdom, such as freedom of the press, speech, and assembly?
Right. Thank you. I think he wants to make Saudi Arabia great again. and more enjoyable. That is very important too. He grew up in a very interesting time in the early 2000s. At that time, Saudi Arabia began to question the boring status or the staggering status quo that the lack of freedom, the lack of entertainment, the pressure of the religious police, the heavy hand of the religious authority and ulama. At that time, I played a role when I was the editor of Al-Watan, among with many editors, in pushing those ideas and discussing those pressures on us, the Saudis. We challenged for the first time the Senior Council on Ulama on a number of issues, from the mixing of the sexes to the sighting of the moon. What is the sighting of the moon? It was an important issue in Saudi Arabia because the Salafi understanding of religion that the people should not see the moon through binoculars or by calculations, and they have to see it physically, and that was a big issue, and it consumed a number of pages in Al-Watan newspaper that I was leading. Of course, when I look back, it was a waste of time. At that time, I'm sure Mohammed bin Salman, as a young man, he attended those gatherings where people will be complaining about and exchange stories about the mutawwi'in come into this coffee house and they arrested this woman and they banned that event, and we will be complaining about that. And on the same time, we will be complaining that the leaders of the country are not doing anything about it. I remember, for example, we ran a story in Al-Watan about a man who was beaten up to death by the religious police, and the governors of Riyadh, which was led by King Salman, the father of Mohammed bin Salman, investigated the issue and come to a conclusion that beating a man on the head is not a reason. It's not a reason of death. And it was a ridiculous statement, and I only had to take it and publish it in the front page with no comments because I couldn't comment on it. But I'm sure Mohammed bin Salman experienced that. I don't know if he went to his father and argued about that. Maybe at that time he said, if I become a king one day, I will change all of this. And he is doing that. So I appreciate what he's doing. He's pushing for reform. He's opening up Saudi Arabia socially. He is freeing us from radicalism. He is doing the miracle that Saudi Arabia was reluctant to do all the time, and that's what probably his biggest selling point here in America today, and that's why he is being received warmly in America, that he is departing Saudi Arabia from radicalism. Since 9/11, and every American president, every American Secretary of State, when he goes to Saudi Arabia, he will open this up with the Saudi officials, and the Saudi officials will give and take. But Mohammed bin Salman did not give and take. He just departs Saudi Arabia from radicalism, and this is good for us too. I'm not complaining as a Saudi Arabian. The Americans are celebrating that. It is good for America, it's good for the world, but it's good also for Saudi Arabia. So he is being celebrated for that. But on the same time, obviously, and this is not spontaneous, it is all planned. I think he believes on leveling the field for his reform. He doesn't want any competition. He doesn't want any counter opinions. He doesn't want any critique. So he almost shut down everybody. And he is moving ahead with his reform, and he thinks he can lead. Where this prescription is said, or did that blueprint, is that in some book? Is that, I don't know. But obviously he is not doing that unintentionally. It is planned. It is prepared. When he arrests intellectuals on last September, it was planned to silence everybody. The purge on corruption, it is planned to make everybody under his mercy. So he is leveling the field and pushing for reform in his own. If he succeeds, if he succeeds, he will succeed alone, and of course we will all celebrate him. If not, maybe he will start looking at us, and that will be an interesting phase. And that's what I'm hoping for that eventually one day he will be looking for the people of Saudi Arabia to include them in his reform. I wish he could do that today, but I don't think he will. He has all the power, he has all the support, and the international community is not pressuring him. The issue of human rights or arrest were not raised in America or in the UK, except for by a journalist or by a brief statement. So he has all the power, and he's going to move on. And I don't think he will look at us for now, but maybe in the near future, I hope.
Great. Thank you, Jamal. Hala, we'll turn to you next. As is well known, Mohammed bin Salman has been portrayed as a reformer in many Western media outlets and think tanks, which emphasize modernization measures related to the status of women and his pronouncements of the need for a more moderate Islam within the kingdom. To what degree does this image correspond to reality? And given that you have been one of the people pushing for reform for an extended period of time consistently, what do you assess as real and what is cosmetic in his reform approach?
Well, first I have a different view from Jamal, basically. I feel like the reforms approach, when it comes, like top-down approach, it doesn't really respond to the needs as portrayed by people. And that's why you see selected types of reforms aimed at certain purposes, but not necessarily towards developing the human capital or investing in the, basically in humans or people or women at large. Opening opportunities in the economy and allowing women to drive might be really part of the economic reforms, but necessarily women would be placed under more, I would say, restricted atmosphere at homes if they're not able to enjoy those kinds of opportunities. And this is where you get very little reforms done. So we don't have that much reforms happening in the family law or the protection from violence law. Until now, women still can be subjected to charges of disobedience or absence from home. So how much or how many women can benefit from those kinds of opportunities if they live in oppressive families or with oppressive guardians? So you get to see how those reforms are somehow not targeting the root causes of restrictions on women. And somehow selected to basically portray certain types of reforms, and how much it's been promoted in international media that women now can attend soccer games or attend, recreational events, which is all good and great. But again, what about the main root causes of discrimination when it comes to nationality, when it comes to family laws, when it comes to the greater issues faced by women and advocated for by the civil society for many years? So what I see is a consolidation of political power that is aimed to basically control, as of course justified by many of the proponents of Mohammed bin Salman, that this kind of steps or to approach or method of government is somehow an insurance that he has enough control to affect a change or basically a necessary act. So this is why any types of criticism, whether coming from economist perspective or economist perspective or critics who comes from Islamist, is necessary because basically he needs to have the acquiescence basically and the support of the community. In order to do so, he cannot have people going against his planned reforms. But to date, you get to see that call, for instance, for moderate Islam is very much promoted when, in fact, this has been an ongoing approach since the 2000s. You get to see people in his own government, like the Grand Mufti, who is, for instance, posting a statement saying that anyone who calls for abolishing the male guardianship is committing a crime against Islam and against the nation. while people who have actually advocated and supported women's rights reforms, have been arrested since September last year, like Dr. Mustafa Al-Hassan, Abdullah Al-Malki, and others. So I really don't understand how that plays out, unless, of course, it is a political agenda, but not a genuine need for reforms. As I said, without enabling the civil society to be a real partner, or the society at large to engage in decision making and basically voicing and being able to prioritize their demands or claims from the government, what reforms are needed and how those reforms should be approached. It's very difficult to call him a reformer when his planned reform or his projected reforms are very much different from the reforms demanded by the people. And, you know, even on driving, women have been calling for that since the 1990s. So he comes now in 2018 to allow women to drive, and we call him a reformer. Basically, and why? Because he's the one who's leading that one, and forgetting about the people who have been doing that, you know, since 1990. So what I'm saying is that I don't see that, you know, the approach to reform, when it's not taking into account the demands of the people, is very much effective or indicative of a reformative personality or a leadership. More I see it as more of tokens, basically, and more like you know, bargaining chips.
Right.
And I think the whole I would say fanfare around reforming women's rights and Islam taps into the international appease, basically. Has succeeded in doing is to create a very effective public messaging and public campaign to promote the new leadership, rather than to affect real change. And we see that from the arbitrary types of decisions, from you know, immediate campaigns of aggression in the regions, or that is really unwarranted, or arrests, wide-scale arrests that are happening, not only the ones affecting the media and the business tycoons, but as well everyday citizens who are intellectuals. And these kinds of approach are very much chaotic, and it doesn't really call out a reform. It doesn't really portray reform, in my opinion.
Right. Thank you, Hala. Kristian, we'll turn to you next. Do you think that Mohammed bin Salman's top-down approach to modernization can succeed in remaking Saudi society? And do you think it's possible to reconcile his tendency towards extra-legal actions with the expectations of international investors whose support is so crucial to his economic vision?
Well, thank you very much for those questions. I think the conundrum for Mohammed bin Salman, to take your second question first, is he's talking to two very different audiences at the same time. With the corruption campaign, for example, to a domestic audience, or at least to an audience of young Saudis who it is always suggested are his main constituency of support, even though we don't necessarily have opinion polling to measure that scale of support, or polling across different parts of the country and backgrounds to see if people perceive the opportunities as being spread equally across the kingdom. It nevertheless is a populist move, trying to take on corruption, vested interests that people had felt challenged by for years, if not decades, an entire business class that perhaps was perceived to have held them back. So that was a populist move, but of course it ran up against the attempts by Mohammed bin Salman to portray a very different message to the international investors, whom he had hosted just 10 days previously at the Future Investment Initiative in Riyadh, where again he was talking up the prospects of a transformative change or period of change in Saudi Arabia as a prelude to trying to attract inward investment. And the fact that for many people who would have gone to Saudi Arabia for the first time, many of the investors, they would have seen a very different Saudi Arabia at the Future Investment Initiative than perhaps they had imagined in their stereotype vision. A Saudi Arabia of change, a city of robots, with a female robot giving Saudi citizenship, and then sort of suddenly have those stereotypes almost reinforced by the nature of the crackdown, the fact that it was done without necessarily a form of due process, using a hastily established new anti-corruption committee which appeared to be above and beyond the law and not subject to any real form of transparency and accountability, the timing was striking, to say the least. And I think it illustrated the difficulty that MBS will have in reassuring both audiences simultaneously. I think perhaps understanding Vision 2030 works best if we think of it as exactly what it is, a vision. It's a statement of intent and aspiration, perhaps. And perhaps even if only 5, 10, 15% of that vision is accomplished, then Mohammed bin Salman's supporters will say, well, we've actually come a long way from where we began. But that's not necessarily how MBS is selling that vision, at least internationally, and especially on his roadshow here through the US and previously in London as well. So I think there's a discrepancy there as well. He's portraying this transformative period of change, almost raising expectations to not dangerous, but riskily high levels, such that if in 2, 3, 5 years nothing significantly really has changed for, say, the prospects of individual people looking to get ahead, looking to get a job, if those jobs aren't there, then they may begin to question, well, what is really changing, and is Mohammed bin Salman the sort of revolutionary that he claims to be? And of course we've seen a lot of his supporters here in Washington buying into that revolutionary sort of Arab Spring type figure of change, clearly sort of taking the top-down approach, but without really pausing to think, to see to what extent there is a bottom-up counterpart. Again, I think the Vision 2030 process has excluded from the planning cycle many of the elements of grassroots input, of what civil society there was, which again has largely been closed down, if not extremely restricted, by the pattern of suppression of dissent over the past year or so. This sort of over-reliance, and again, it's not just in Saudi Arabia, in all Gulf states, this over-reliance upon external consultants, external groups who sort of speak the language of sort of neoliberal reform that they know will appeal to the external audience. And I think many people also noticed that whenever he made a statement on Vision 2030, it was made for the international media consumption in mind, whereas on a daily basis, Saudis were seeing new charges, new fees. They were seeing sort of new initiatives being passed to try and tinker with some of the aspects of the welfare state, but they weren't the ones that were publicized, even though they were the ones that caused kind of economic austerity to some extent on individuals. So there's a degree of residual resentment there. So I think at some point, as both speakers have already said, there will have to be a reconciliation between the top-down and bottom-up aspects, and he will have to include Saudi society in this change, because if he doesn't, and then people judge in a while down the line that this change hasn't necessarily touched them, there could be a backlash. And I think we've seen in the past, of course, Mohammed bin Salman would claim we're in a different era right now, but we've seen in the past there has been backlash when Saudi Arabian society and economy has changed too quickly without necessarily trying to consider the potential for discontent among certain segments of the population. Probably a tendency for journalists who do go to Riyadh and spend 4 or 5 hours with Mohammed bin Salman to forget that Saudi Arabia is not just Riyadh, and it is already a country of economic and social disparities to some extent, and there could also be a danger if those disparities are perceived to have been widened, if some of the benefits from these changes are seen to be sort of limited to certain segments of society. So I think for that to be offset, he does need to build in a sort of social aspect to this. Arguably, some of the social reforms that have been announced are precisely to almost deflect attention from the economic difficulties that he will face in making those reforms, and of course they strengthen the narrative that he is trying to portray. It's difficult to tell right now how that will succeed. I think if I was watching yesterday's press conference with Donald Trump, I actually would have been quite dismayed to have seen a U.S. president treat his Saudi counterpart as if he were basically just a source of opportunities for the U.S. And some of the sort of tenor and demeanor of the president was quite remarkable. And celebrating it as the art of the deal made kind of visible is perhaps a short-term interpretation of that cardboard cutout.
Thank you, Kristian. And last but certainly not least, Tamara, two separate ideas or two separate topics in this question. One, you recently returned from Saudi Arabia, so I was hoping that you could share maybe your top 2 or 3 takeaways from that trip. And second, what do you think that the United States and Saudi Arabia each want out of the bilateral relationship? And what do you think the United States has gained and risked by virtue of the Trump administration's close embrace of Mohammed bin Salman?
Thanks, Andrew, and let me start by saying what a privilege it is to sit on a panel with four such knowledgeable folks, and I feel very much like a dilettante amongst experts here. So in answering your question, Andrew, I guess I'll pick up where Kristian left off. I think that the point about raising expectations and whether those expectations can be met is a really, really key thing to watch in the years to come. And it seems to me that it's very clear that there is some excitement and even exhilaration among a certain class of Saudis who are well prepared to benefit from the realization of this vision. But there are also millions and millions of Saudis for whom it's not clear what their place is in this vision. And so when you're walking in a shopping district in Riyadh and you see now that every retail store has its certification in the window that it is compliant with the new value-added tax, many of them also have signs in the window that say, customers, we'll pay your VAT. In other words, this new revenue stream, this shift in expectations, the burden of that is falling on consumers and small businesses, the private sector. And so that's where the costs are being paid, how do you expect that sector of the economy is going to grow and sort of juice the realization of this vision? I think that that's just one small example of some of the incoherence in the expectations that are being created in the vision that's been laid out. So I'll just to put a point on your comments there, Kristian. On the regional issues, I think that sort of in line with the decision-making style and the fundamental orientation of the Crown Prince that we see in domestic policy. Of course, we've also seen this reflected in regional policy very much. Bold moves that seem to be designed to unsettle adversaries and put friends and allies on notice. And very much a sort of my way or the highway approach to a lot of regional issues. Now, again, in context of the disordered state of the region, the expansion of Iranian influence, the competition for power, this is an understandable approach, but it is a dramatic departure from previous Saudi practice. And it is unsettling adversaries, but it's also unsettling friends. And one of my takeaways from my visit, which included Kuwait as well as Saudi Arabia and broader discussions with colleagues in the Gulf, is that on the one hand, I think there's a lot of hope in other parts of the Gulf that the domestic social and economic reforms in Saudi Arabia will succeed. One, because these other places have been concerned about the lack of reform in Saudi Arabia, and they see this as potentially stabilizing their biggest neighbor. But also because if reforms work in Saudi Arabia, it provides a sort of retroactive justification and added momentum for the reforms that have been taking place elsewhere in the Gulf. And the same fundamental economic challenge, which is how to live with low oil prices and a growing population, they're all trying to confront. And so if Saudi can succeed, then it gives everybody else more room. Now, there's another piece of that, which is that as these other Gulf governments look at Saudi regional policy, whether it's the conflict with Qatar, the war in Yemen, the approach to the Levant, to Lebanon, Syria, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, there's an increasing sense that I heard that this Saudi government, unlike in the past, is not so much taking into account the interests and concerns of other Gulf Arab states, that they can't rely on it to do so. And that, so there's always been this tension within the GCC where Saudi Arabia is the largest, it's the most powerful, it has the most capability, and therefore everyone has to defer to it to a certain extent, and they rely on it to understand that their interests are not all completely convergent all the time. But right now, there's not room to be divergent from Saudi interests at all. And so that, I think, is creating some unhappiness. In terms of the relationship with the United States, I think to a large extent, both sides are focused on short-term image creation in a very transactional manner. They both have an interest in looking like they're shoulder to shoulder facing the world. For the Saudis, that is an endorsement of their regional policies. It strengthens their hand against their enemies, and it gives them additional leverage with their regional friends. And on the U.S. side, as President Trump said very explicitly yesterday, it draws a very sharp contrast with President Obama and the way he was perceived in amongst the Arab states of the Gulf as someone who had withdrawn American influence from the region. That was certainly the perception. And so I think they've been able to use their interactions so far very successfully to create that image on both sides. Going forward, though, once they actually have to start doing things together, it gets a little more complicated. And I think we've seen this already with respect to the conflict within the GCC, where the Trump administration's initial approach was, shoulder to shoulder with Riyadh. In fact, it even seemed like there may have been a green light given ahead of time or an implicit green light. But we've seen, I think, since the summer, a sort of slowly shifting American approach. And now that President Trump seems to be indicating that he wants to host a U.S. GCC summit, again, to contrast with Obama, who had a very difficult U.S. GCC summit. He wants to have a very successful and loving one. Well, it's hard to have a U.S. GCC summit when the GCC heads of state are at loggerheads. So now President Trump has his own interest in resolving this crisis, and that's before you even get to the substantive policy issues of how do you fight ISIS if the GCC is split up? How do you combat Iran if the GCC is split up? What happens to Arab diplomacy with Israel if there's no inter-Arab diplomatic mechanism that you can use as leverage in that process? So I think for policy reasons, but now also for political and prestige reasons, President Trump is starting to shift his approach. My real question is, how well does he understand these issues, the complications that all of these previous panelists have laid out? How well does he understand the leverage the United States has in this relationship to shape Saudi policy? And then, of course, the big question, is he willing to use it?
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you all. I think those responses show just what the type of caliber of individuals that we have on this panel. I will exercise my prerogative and ask one question, and then we can open up questions to the floor, and we also have some questions submitted via Twitter that we can also unearth. But one of the key things that emerged from all of your commentaries is that there's a high level of image involved in what's taking place. And that's not unusual. Public relations image is integral to most aspects of modern life and certainly governments. But do you think that Mohammed bin Salman recognizes the difference between what is propaganda, what is a public relations message, and what's actually happening? And I ask that because there was that extraordinary article in the New York Times yesterday by David Kirkpatrick on this cartoon that portrayed Saudi Arabia conducting a military operation against Iran, and that results in the capture of Qasem Soleimani. I think most military experts would say that Saudi Arabia does not have the military capacity to do so, but there is value in presenting that image. does he recognize what's real from what is manufactured? Because that can certainly have a major impact on what Saudi behavior is. Is he really overestimating what's capable of being produced, and are the people who are seeking to curry favor with him playing in or exacerbating that problem? Jamal, do you want?
I begin to worry about that. When I see some of the statements he made recently, is it hopeful thinking, is it being diplomacy, or it is departure from reality? For example, when he said to David Ignatius that Saad al-Hariri is more powerful today after Riyadh than he was before Riyadh. That, I'm sure everybody in this room agree, no, it is not true. Saad al-Hariri is much weaker in the hand of Hezbollah after Riyadh, after what happened in Riyadh. When he was in Cairo, he met with a group of Egyptian journalists, and he said a number of things that he did not expect Egypt to come out of his predicament, but he was very much overwhelmed by what he saw, and he think President Sisi is doing a great job in Egypt. Many of you here in this room can make write an article arguing whether Egypt is making a comeback economically or not. He also said 80% of the Arab world is safe. It is not true the Arab world is falling apart. Again, we can argue about that too. So he also, and this is my article today in the Washington Post about his top-down approach, he said to the Egyptian journalists that he is planning to build a Red Sea Riviera that will attract 3 million tourists every year. I said in the article that there is no free press in Egypt nor in Saudi Arabia to question him and say, we already have thousands of tourist locations in Egypt and buildings and resorts and hotels that lack tourists. So let's fix what we have today before we build a new Red Sea Riviera. Is that PR talk or reality? I will come to what happened yesterday. I see President Obama and Mohammed bin Salman, each one. President Trump. Sorry. Yes, you are right. President Trump and MBS talking in two parallel issues. Trump is talking about Saudi money coming to America. So what about, okay, in return for that Saudi money, which I don't think it was appropriate of him. I'm sure Mohammed bin Salman wasn't comfortable with the way he portrayed Saudi Arabia, and he was, and President Trump is also wrong when he talk about those money are peanuts to us. Saudi Arabia has a serious poverty problem. Money is not peanuts to us. To spend billions of dollars on frigates or on Air Force, it is serious things. Today, the Saudi Shura Council is talking about, for the first time, 40% or 35% unemployment. The official number is 12%, 12.5%. Issam al-Zamil, who's jailed, when I met him before he left to Saudi Arabia, 2 days later he was arrested last September. He showed me a graph where he argued that the least number of unemployment in Saudi has to be more than 20%. But now we are talking about 35%. So as much as Donald Trump is concerned about providing jobs for Americans, Mohammed bin Salman should be concerned about providing jobs for Saudis. When foreigners in Saudi Arabia object or come out in the street or burn tires when their salaries are late, we will deport them. But if Saudis do that in 5 years' time, we cannot deport them. He has to deal with that. So I will end with the following, that we need to see the reality of politics between President Trump and Saudi Arabia. What Mohammed bin Salman needs, if it is true that he invested all that money in the American economy, I'm sure he wants something in return. I see 3 things he wants. He wants the administration to help Saudi Arabia to push Iran out of the region. Can that happen? Does he realize that the limitation of the Americans, administration and Pentagon and their interest, whether to be able to push Iran out of Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, it's not. Actually, Donald Trump wants to get out. The story in the Washington Post that he asked Saudi Arabia for help for $4 billion to get out of Syria. I'm sure Saudi Arabia would rather to pay him money to stay in Syria, not to leave Syria. So this is number one. Number two, the nuclear plans of Saudi Arabia. I'm sure Mohammed bin Salman wants an agreement with the Americans. Maybe we can get that to ease some of the regulations that will allow Saudi Arabia to compete with Iran. And if the Iranians can do enrichment to a certain level, we have the right to do the same enrichment. The last thing that I presume Mohammed bin Salman will be asking of the Americans is to lay off on the Qatari issue. Can that happen? So again, about reality and politics, yeah, it is easy to say that the Arab world is 80% of the Arab world is still in safe hand. It is still good, but reality doesn't say so. So I'm not really sure whether he is saying that as a PR, as assuring the masses, or he really sees things differently from how we see them.
Tamara?
Yeah, I can understand why that sort of video would raise the question that you ask, Andrew, but I guess I have to push back a little bit. I'm not sure what evidence there is to suggest that he's living in some kind of a fantasy land. I suspect that rather he's falling prey to the things that happen to a leader when they centralize control, create very, very high expectations and strong accountability, and basically put themselves in a position where they're gonna overestimate their own capabilities, and nobody is gonna correct them, and nobody is gonna bring them bad news. You know, the Hariri episode to me is a perfect example of overestimating capabilities, overestimating leverage, and also I think failing to use Saudi soft power, which traditionally has been much more effective in regional affairs than arm twisting. I think that there's a dynamic that's quite common in autocratic environments, and that I think we may see play out in Saudi Arabia, which is that, you know, he's already made very clear that he doesn't tolerate failure. He'll dismiss people from their government positions, even if they're very senior, if they're not achieving. So he's demanding accountability. He's willing to throw people in jail with very little provocation if he thinks that they are behaving badly. And the result is that I suspect a lot of people are afraid to give him bad news, even if it may not be their fault. They don't want to be the messenger, the bearer of bad tidings. And so, you know, where that leaves an autocratic ruler is in a situation where they have to cultivate this they have to cultivate the image that they are distant from society, because that's how they rescue themselves from responsibility for failure. And, you know, the classic, this goes all the way back to Imperial Russia. You know, if only the Tsar knew that we were starving here, he would fix it. And so if that's the road that he ends up going down because of the repression and the climate of intimidation that's been created, that's unnecessary, but it's also very predictable.
Totally agree with Tamara here that definitely I think since the beginning, Prince Mohammed bin Salman realized and I think it has an influence as well from the UAE model, where a lot of the initiatives to control the social media, to create you know, more of a, I think, an image of basically the reforming leader, the central for modernization, the visionary, basically, person, has been really played out in so many, and I think even in international media, you know, people who are coming to the royal visits and basically being briefed on, you know, the massive line of reforms that are in place. So I think I agree completely that he is in a position where he cannot really see what is a reality because of the intimidation. And again, that is not something new. That has been, and I think it goes back basically to the idea that a monarch, the absolute monarchy environment, really is not conducive to correct itself, because any means for checks and balances on decision making does not come naturally in this kind of climate. And you know, the war in Yemen is the best example, because that's basically what he started his era with, or his basically presence or appearance on the political sphere with. It came as very much an aggressive response to something that really does not warrant this kind of massive response. And the fact that they did not pull out of it, and the massive basically need to create this kind of coalitions, alliances, the U.S. Saudi Arabia summit, and then the U.S. GCC summits, all those kinds of visible, I would say, signs of grandiose, if you think of it. I think it is very much telling on, yes, he does have certain image that he needs to create, and he knows and understands the significance of such image to promote him, and to promote him as in the light that he wants. And it has been tested before in different environments. One of them is in Dubai, as basically the hub city, successful city of the Gulf. And the other thing is he can basically get away, as Tamara was mentioning, he can easily get away from any kinds of accountability, because people look at all those, forms basically of success surrounding him, and testimonies from international reputed writers. Who some of them would admit, like for instance the articles of Thomas Friedman, where he mentioned that all the advisors are very much intimidated to say anything, but at the same time say, yes, we have to support him, we have to basically embrace this kind of visionary leaders. But again, how can you do that if you're not putting any kinds of measures or basically checks and balances against this kind of aggression? So I totally agree with your assessment of things.
Yeah, just building on that last point about the advisors, let's not forget that the signature announcement he's made of the Aramco IPO was made in his interview with The Economist. And that was one of a number of interviews he made at the beginning of 2016 with Western publications, which I think were designed to introduce him to a Western policy audience who had felt comfortable with the idea of Mohammed bin Nayef as a safe pair of hands to carry Saudi Arabia to the next generation, and looked at Mohammed bin Salman's sudden appearance on the stage with a degree of uncertainty. So he had this strategy to talk to the international media, to talk in terms of which they could relate. And from what it does seem, at least, that the Aramco IPO was floated as an idea against the advice of some of his advisors. And of course, we're still seeing, more than 2 years later, the difficulty of making that initial idea into reality. We're seeing the struggle, the constant putting back of deadlines, because once, of course, he's said it, it's got to happen, at least in some shape or form. And I think, again, that speaks to the difficulties of providing advice in an environment where if you provide advice that doesn't necessarily show a success, then you're in some difficulty. And I think until the last few years, Saudi Arabia was never a one-man show. You had policy-making centers, 4, 5, 6 key figures, often members of the family who'd been in position for decades, which wasn't necessarily the most effective way of making policy. We always used to complain that Saudi policy was far too slow, and now we complain it's too fast. But at least it ensured that there was no real risk of policy being announced without necessarily being thought through. And as Hala said, those checks and balances have been stripped away, and I think this is now the result. And to me, the Aramco IPO encapsulates, on a non-sort of risky foreign policy venture at least, the difficulty of living with this new environment.
Great, thank you. Let's open up the questions. A couple notes. One, Louisa has a microphone for the live stream, so please wait until you receive the microphone to ask your questions. And 2, I will say this knowing that it is futile. Please try to ask questions as opposed to offering commentary. If you want to discuss these issues, we can find another forum. And please do speak up so we ensure that it's heard. Mohammed Dia?
You're the autocrat. You don't have to.
My question is about the relation between Mohammed bin Salman and Islam. So you mentioned how the codes of moderate Islam. So is there an emerging form of state Islam that he's trying to push to? And what is his relation with other form of moderate Islam that are existing in other countries? And I mentioned here Muslim Brotherhood related forms of Islam that Saudi Arabia was not agreeing on since the Arab Spring.
Okay. I think this is one of the most challenging questions to him. It is easy said, I'm going to return to moderate Islam. But what is moderate Islam? I'm going to return to before 1979. What was there before 1979? I grew up before 1979, and it wasn't moderate Saudi Arabia. Okay, the government was the only difference between before 79 and after 79. The government did not empower the religious establishment to go out in the streets, but the religious establishment was as rigid as they were today. So it was, if someone to claim, it was the government who allowed the establishment to come out in the street and force their narrow views in the people. He has a serious problem with the Brotherhood. Even though the Brotherhood could be the answer for modernity and Islam, he doesn't disagree, he despises the Brotherhood. And he has a serious despise to them. But the problem, Saudi Arabia cannot be a secular state. It cannot depart from Islam. For its history, remember, it is established as an Islamic state, a Wahhabi Islamic state, and it has the 2 grand mosques, Mecca and Medina. So there is no way. If he wants to, he cannot depart from Islam. Or depart from, astaghfirullah, I don't mean depart from Islam. I mean to depart from Islam as the guiding force, the guiding structure, the guiding for Saudi Arabia. Actually, the constitution, or we don't call it a constitution, النظام الأساسي للحكم, the basic law of Saudi Arabia. And again, we don't call it a constitution because Islamically we shouldn't call it a constitution, which is it describes Saudi Arabia as an Islamic state. So we are an Islamic state. So Islam is going to follow Saudi Arabia. He has to found an answer what Islam to follow. But there is no, right now, there is no environment for a proper discourse to discuss about that. There is, often you will find Saudi writers, commentators on Saudi television or in a Saudi gathering who will go bashing political Islam. And I found that's ironic, that to bash political Islam in a country that it is the mother and father of political Islam. So what I expect, there will be less of religion in Saudi Arabia for the time being, till he needs to discover some form to accommodate Islam as a guiding force in Saudi Arabia. I'll just briefly, now in the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh and Myanmar, there is hardly a Saudi relief organization there. There's Kuwaitis, there are Qataris, but Saudi is not there. Why? Because we are in limbo right now. We don't know what to do with our relief organization, that one day we were so big on that. Should we go there or not? Should we support the Rohingya or Saudi Arabia is in confusion when its relationship to Islam today. There is no answer yet, but he's going to hunt him. He has to provide the answer. He's not under pressure today, but eventually he has to come with an answer. The intimidation that is spread in the kingdom is not allowing voices of Islamic activists to come out for the time being. Everybody is keeping silence, but what to do with Islam when you are in an Islamic state? You have to accommodate some form of Islam in your country.
I have a very quick follow-up. I think in Vision 2030, Prince Mohammed bin Salman and I think his advisor realized the potential for Islam as a soft power, as a means of influence, not inside Saudi Arabia, but outside Saudi Arabia at large. And I think the Rohingya came so much in the UN and Human Rights Council as a point to shift basically from Saudi Arabia's discussion. So I think if you follow through the Saudi delegations within the UN, they have so much presence when it comes to Palestinians, to rights, or from basically their responsibility as an Islamic state. So Islamic identity is part and parcel of the new vision for 2030. But what I think is happening is more of relegation Islam into the private sphere and more in control of the state, so that Islam is used to advance economic rights, but not to strip Saudi Arabia of its Islamic influence globally, per se. That has been very helpful, but I think at least symbolically, the Rohingya has been part of the interest of Saudi Arabia when it comes to its basically presence as still custodian of Islam, not only inside Saudi Arabia, but outside as well.
Yes, in the back. Yes, in the blue, I'm sorry, the light blue shirt.
Hi everyone, my name is Khattab al-Rouhani, I'm a journalist from Yemen. We have seen some actions that is like actions specifically in Yemen, and the crisis with Qatar seen as interest of the UAE rather than Saudi interest. And my question is, to what degree do you think Mohammed bin Zayed has influence or / control over Mohammed bin Salman?
I mean, they certainly have an alignment, at least at the moment, in terms of shared visions on a kind of grand strategic level. I think what came apparent over the past year from some of the leaked emails that we've seen flying around is that the Emiratis have kind of come to the conclusion that Mohammed bin Salman has to be supported at all costs, and that there's no alternative. Which is also some of the narrative that we've seen in some of the media coverage here, which again have said we need to support him because there is no alternative, forgetting that until last year there was a crown prince in between. But that is never really mentioned. But that was very much the message of some of the sort of coverage from Abu Dhabi. And to the extent that when Mohammed bin Salman was just a defense minister and was sort of rising up, it could have been seen that Mohammed bin Zayed was a more senior partner. I mean, he is 57 years old, he is a generation older, he is old enough to be his father, and to some extent is a father figure. And I think Mohammed bin Zayed saw in Mohammed bin Salman a similar sort of bigger picture, can-do mentality, willing to shake things up, and obviously perhaps encouraged him to, and supported him. I think the risk or the tension in that relationship will come when Mohammed bin Salman eventually becomes king, because by most metrics, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are not equal partners. And if Mohammed bin Zayed ever imagined that he could control Mohammed bin Salman, I think that is a risky calculation to make. And perhaps in Yemen or perhaps elsewhere, with any resolution in Qatar or anything else, I think they will find out that Mohammed bin Salman will act with Saudi interests in mind, not necessarily with the interests of neighboring states.
I'm going to ask a question from Yara Bayumi at Thomson Reuters. What would you say the tipping point looks like in Saudi Arabia when there may be a realization that they're not seeing the benefit from Mohammed bin Salman's reforms? When might we see that in Saudi Arabia?
Unemployment. Jobs. He has to provide jobs.
I'm going to give a somewhat different answer, not because I disagree. I think that that's very true, but I also think that there's something else going on that's been going on, and that his reforms are, in a way, are going to accelerate. And we have to understand that, to a large extent, the government of Saudi Arabia, the kingdom, is trying to catch up to changes in society and to changes in the global economy. They're trying to catch up, they're trying to capitalize on things that are already happening, and to a certain extent, they're going to accelerate them. And one of those is social change. Going back to the points Hala made in her opening remarks, you now have, there was already very rapid urbanization. There's going to be more urbanization. There are going to be more Saudi women who are reasonably well educated, who are getting good quality jobs, who are contributing to household incomes. The number of children per woman has already declined precipitously. So urban middle-class Saudi families are having 3 kids, okay? And you have this nuclear family that is becoming much more important to people than these tribal structures that they are now physically distant from, as well as kind of psychologically distant from. And with women participating more in the economy, contributing more to the household, they have rising expectations along with everybody else. You already see this manifesting in tensions over the guardianship law that for now are only going to play out in the court system. And I agree with Hala that this, that the state is very, very behind the curve in thinking through the implications of all this social change. But that's where I see pressure building that I don't think the state has a way to address, and I'm not even sure that they're really aware of it.
Okay. There's a very important economic transformation happening in Saudi Arabia that is worth spending extensive time studying it. And I don't see even Mohammed bin Salman taking credit for that. As much as his reform, social reform, is changing the country when it comes to entertainment, when it comes to departure from radicalism, there's 2 things are happening today, and they are going unnoticed. Number one, an emerging new merchant class, because the old merchant class is very much bruised after the Ritz-Carlton. It's not used to the new rule of the games, and many of them are just probably will be departing the scene. Many companies will be going probably bankrupt. There is many companies right now are signing IOU notices to the government in order, because the government really doesn't want to keep companies under the PIF, the Public Investment Fund. They would rather to have cash. So they are telling the Ritz-Carlton released or detainees that we will keep those companies or those lands of yours, those assets of yours under control until you pay us that amount of money. So there will be many business people in Saudi Arabia working for the foreseeable future for the government. That is going to change the private sector in Saudi Arabia. Another major change happening is the levy imposed on foreign labor, driving foreigners out of the country. I very much support that. I wrote a book about that, and I think it is the right thing to do. And it's going to have an effect, a major effect socially. It will change the work ethics. It will change the way Saudi people see jobs opportunity and business opportunity. Let's remember that when we are talking about foreigners, we're not talking about 12% as you have here in America. We are talking about 70%. 70% of 70% of the labor force in Saudi Arabia is controlled by foreigners' jobs, and a number I don't have. Many of the small and medium businesses in Saudi Arabia are controlled and owned by foreigners, with the Saudi Arabian as a front only. And the government is going today at that. I haven't seen a story, but there should be a story coming out about the vacancies, the jobs, the shops are being closed down, the vacant apartments. I met Yemenis who left Saudi Arabia and they are moving to Turkey. And I'm talking about the rich Yemenis who made good money, who are able to buy a house in Turkey and move to Turkey. Others are moving to Egypt. That is a huge transformation. I could call it reform, I could call it transformation, and ironically, Prince Mohammed is not taking credit for it. That is as much of a transformation as much as empowering women, in my opinion. So it is, and it will, the success of this transformation could be a tipping point. It has to succeed. If that transformation will lead to Saudi Arabians owning businesses and owning jobs, then Mohammed bin Salman will be saved for another 10 or 20 years. Maybe indefinitely.
Back out
50
in the
years.
audience. Sir, are you in the middle?
Well, first, I would like to thank the panelists for their great contribution in this discussion. My question for both of you, Jamal and Hala, since you both were based in Saudi Arabia, one of the main pillars of the Saudi Vision 2030 was the creation of the Entertainment Commission, or the Entertainment Committee. And as we see that there's an increase in the power of this committee every day, while at the same time there's a huge decline in the power that is given to the religious police and the people that carry the ideology of Salafism or Wahhabism. And as we both know that there's audiences for both, for the Entertainment Commission and the Wahhabi ideology. And we have also seen that there's been a backlash between the two groups in Saudi Arabia. Do you think we're actually going to reach a point where there's going to be a huge, dangerous step from people who support Wahhabism against the Entertainment Commission? Thank you.
I don't see that. I see that people are very much embracing the social opening, and you get to see how the tickets are actually sold out from the first few days once an event has been announced. As well, I don't see that there is this, power to the Wahhabis or to any religious group to challenge the state, and that is not something new. The Wahhabi institution, and before that even, not during Mohammed bin Salman, has been very much contained, and how the decision of stripping religious authorities from their field work, basically power, has passed without any kinds of significant repercussions. When the announcement of lifting the women driving ban, we as activists who lobbied for years, for such things, have witnessed all kinds of aggressions, from statements signed by people, by religious groups, from aggression online, from threats even of murder, basically, and killing. And you get to see how, when the decision was announced by Crown Prince to lift the driving ban, the lineup of clerics, the lineup of religious people on national TV to show their support for the wise decision of the state and how they really consider the needs of women. And it's really remarkable to see how these people are very much dependent on the state for their survival and for their power. So they're not going to challenge the state. So I don't see that there is any, I would say, tension in that regard. People need the entertainment, and they paid for it, traveling to all neighboring countries. And it was a very good economic decision to create the entertainment activity or commission. But what should be wiser is to leave the room for people to create their events without having to be sponsored by the state, because it adds an unnecessary, step of censorship and control over basically a venue that should be free and creative and open for people to express their creativity, basically.
My question to Mr. Jamal, you've mentioned that 70% of labor is controlled by foreigners in Saudi Arabia. Most of these jobs are low paid and in construction. With a deficit of $52 billion this year, could the government in the next following year create good paid job for Saudi, and could we see the unemployment rate go down from 12.5%?
We need a very open narrative about that. This morning, I saw news that the Shura Council is debating the true number of unemployment, and they use the number of 40%. That is scary. And it could be true. Can the government provide jobs? I don't know. The only way to provide jobs, in my opinion, right now, is to push foreigners out. I get many angry comments about that when I write those ideas of mine, and I wrote a book about that, and they call me racist or pro-Trump. I'm not, but it's just unnatural for a country as big as Saudi Arabia to have 70% of his labor force are foreign. It's just unnatural. I'm worried that Prince Mohammed bin Salman still believes in the rentary state. Like he has, when he's talking about diversifying sources of income to the Saudi budget, to the Saudi national treasury, oil is #1 source of income. Now he wants to create money generated from investment coming from the PIF, the Public Investment Fund, that is not yet as efficient as the Norwegian one. So I don't think really the Public Investment Fund can provide the alternative. But even if it does, he's still along the same old line that the government will be providing the income and the income will be passed by the people. It is not the other way around. It will be much better for Saudi Arabia to convert into the Western democratic system where the people work, pay taxes, provide, and become a source of income, to convert us, the Saudi people, from being a cost center into a profit center. But that has a political implication to it that he has to address. But it is more sustainable, it's much better for Saudi Arabia to go down that road, to, even if it will lead to downsizing the economy by doing only the things that we, the Saudi people, will do. There are many industries in Saudi Arabia, they will collapse with the levy on foreign laborers, because the only advantage they have, it is cheap workers. It is just like if you in America, rather than sending your products to China to be manufactured, you bring Chinese to America to manufacture them. Of course, that will make a huge social transformation in America if you do that. That's what we are doing. So there will be factories shut down, but again, I think there is a need for Mohammed bin Salman to spend more time at Economy 101 rather than to go into this futuristic project of building futuristic cities that will generate income, because those cities might be just another white elephant. He already has 2 major cities that were built with a good attention by King Abdullah, and they are staggering. They're standing still. King Abdullah Financial City, 70-something buildings, beautiful buildings, that they don't have occupants, and they are in the middle of Riyadh. And King Abdullah Economic City by the Red Sea, that something like maybe 20% of his capacity is being utilized. This is where he needs to work. This is where he needs to spend more time at, not to build this Neom city of the future that could consume all of our fortune, like $500 billion. That is what is being budgeted for the Neom project.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a couple questions, and then you can answer. Kristian, I'd like you to discuss the status of the Shia minority since King Salman became ascended to the throne. That's an issue that hasn't come up. And for Hala and Tamara, I want to ask, since partly this panel is motivated by Mohammed bin Salman being in Washington, what is the potential role for the United States in terms of supporting domestic political reforms within Saudi Arabia? Hala, as an activist, do you think that the U.S. can play a positive role in encouraging MBS to move in that direction? And Tamara, from your experience working in the U.S. government, what are your thoughts on that? Kristian, can you speak first?
Well, I think there are structural constraints on the Shia communities in Saudi Arabia that no king, including Salman, has really addressed in any serious manner. And I think the continuing escalation of tension with Iran continues to have a side effect of sort of lumping the Shia with a sort of other in Saudi society that precludes them from effective or kind of equitable consideration as sort of Saudi citizens in the same sense of the word as it means for everyone else. And so none of those structural sort of constraints seem to have been addressed. We've seen the increase in sectarian rhetoric, especially part of a longer-term thing predating King Salman, going back to the aftermath of the 2003 war in Iraq. Obviously, the conflict in Yemen is increasingly being portrayed in sectarian terms as well. Clearly, there's soaring tension with Iran, so as long as those kind of other discourse is there, it's probably quite hard to see any real progress being made. And again, the transformational aspirations of Vision 2030, if they're not seen to be spread equitably across Saudi society, they could further magnify some of the differences that already exist. And that's going to be a challenge not just for the Shia, but for, Saudi Arabia is not a homogenous society. It's already a society of significant regional, economic, social, religious disparities. And so if some of those benefits are seen just to accrue in a small segment, that could amplify some of the cracks that kind of underlay the system.
Well, just to add one thing. So one of the factors that played out because of the aggression in the region is the changing political sentiment when it comes to the tribal, basically, position in Saudi Arabia. So it has been very much highlighted within the crisis with Qatar that the tribal leaders now have specific payroll, on the payroll basically of the state, which has been not formal before Qatari crisis. It was an astonishing thing to see how new groups are now gaining more privilege and prominence, while other groups, like the religious groups maybe, are now going to the back of the line. So what I see is, yes, there is very much of a disparity in socio-political position of different groups, including the Shia and the women as well, who are now maybe brought to prominence because they can contribute significantly to the household income and cushion against the austerity measures of the state. But at the same time, there are so many issues involved. Some of them are structural, some of them are the approach to reforms, which really does not help in creating jobs. I'm totally against having, kicking out people, because we have whole sectors that are not possibly, conducive to employ citizens, like, for instance, the constructions, the healthcare. There are huge demands. So it's very much difficult to engage, but I see some kinds of approaches and policies, like having, for instance, a minimum wage, which really tap onto the need, basically, to hire foreigners, because if you're going to pay Saudis and foreigners the same, why bring foreigner, unless, of course, there is no Saudi candidate, which can be more effective and less harmful to basically benefit from the potential of anyone, regardless of the nationality. So to go on the question of basically human rights, it's one of the most concerning questions, because has been, since the Arab Spring, has been very much placed under so much restrictions as civil society, and it's not part of the foreign agenda, foreign policies of the U.S. or other international patrons of Saudi Arabia. Were largely because the interest was in the economy, and I felt really offended as a Saudi person looking at the interview yesterday when President Trump brought those pictures and was pointing, to Crown Prince, saying, this is peanuts. This is, like, I felt like this is, I'm not rich or anything, but I'm not even taking that money. But the point is, I just felt like this is really indicative of the lack of overseas power of citizens of Saudi Arabia on where to channel the money. That even when the government has made a commitment to reduce their spending on arms, we have to do that in order to gain this kind of political patronage, or to please the political patrons, basically. So one thing would be to empower Congress people, in their quest to influence the foreign policies, to reduce the need for basically excessive militant basically aggression in the region, not only for Saudi Arabia but for Yemen. It is in our best interest as Saudi and as activists to find a peaceful resolution for conflicts and to reduce this very aggressive wars in the region. That will also, once the war is finished, will take its toll on the economy of both Yemen and Saudi Arabia, because we're going to have to invest in rebuilding efforts. So it is of no one's interest, basically, to sell this huge arms to basically facilitate and foster aggression. The other thing is to support the civil society, not because human rights is important or a commitment. It's because of their role to provide the missing element in good governance, which is the checks and balances. So I think that is the message that is usually not usually considered or overlooked repeatedly when discussing the foreign policies of the U.S. or of the U.K. or France or any other government. And you get to see how immediate the intervention happened when the Lebanese prime minister was in trouble. But nothing has been mentioned, in this visit of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman or in previous interaction with the U.S. officials when it comes to prominent people who have really questioning our own society against the aggressive measures of policies, whether it's in economy or in lack of due process or respect of law. Without those voices inside Saudi Arabia and outside Saudi Arabia, without those voices, we're not going to be able to see effective transformation and protection for business that lacks until now the legal framework and the institutional capacity to welcome foreign investments. So even when you plan for Vision 2030 and you're trying to invite foreign investors to come and invest in Saudi Arabia, it is very difficult to do so without the rule of law and institutional support, which is largely missing now from the dialogue. And the only basically measure to ensure that is to have those people who are concerned citizens and active society and active civil agents to be able to provide those kinds of monitoring and oversee power over the government that really does not have any effective rule of law.
Thanks. So it's a little bit odd to answer to try to answer this question about how the United States can support meaningful political reforms and the role of civil society in Saudi Arabia when the current U.S. administration has proudly proclaimed its utter lack of interest in doing that anywhere in the world. And yet, I think that Hala is exactly right to note that it is very difficult to see how this Saudi government reform project succeeds without creating a feedback loop with citizens, without reflecting the aspirations and expectations of citizens, and without hearing reasonable critiques from citizens about what's working and what's not working and where the gaps are. Now, what I would say is that the U.S. government has, at its best, an indirect role in trying to encourage or create that kind of feedback loop. And as Hala has already said, I think very eloquently, it is Saudis who have to set the priorities for their country. I think at its best, the U.S. government has been able to do a few things that matter in terms of creating an enabling environment within which that can take place. The first, it gets to the issue of rule of law and legal frameworks. A lot of what has happened in the last few months that Jamal has written about, that we have observed in terms of increased repression, in terms of intimidation, is happening, not according to even explicit Saudi due process, and legal frameworks in the kingdom are really underdeveloped, particularly when it comes to these social and political questions. And of course, there's an advantage for that for the government in that if you are a group of citizens and you want to form an association, well, there is no association law, so the government can decide on its own, based on its own criteria on a given day, whether they want you to operate or not. But I think that precisely for the reasons that Hala noted, there is room for the United States and other outside governments to push on creation of legal frameworks, codifying law, and that sort of opens a pathway for some of these issues to get litigated. There can also be direct pressure on governments to create more room or leave more room for civil society, because there's no government in the world, no matter how brilliant, no matter how competent, that has all the answers to all the problems and challenges that are faced by its society. And Saudi, the kingdom is full of young, energetic, ambitious citizens who have all kinds of ideas for how to make their communities better, how to make their country better. They are proud of their country. They want it to be more successful. And giving them room to do that only adds wind beneath the wings of this vision for the future. That would be how I would make the argument. And then finally, I think in the past, the United States government has had some success at very small scale, to be sure, in supporting Saudi citizens who are working to implement those ideas, whether it is on entrepreneurship, training women lawyers, environmental engagement, training candidates to run for municipal councils. There's been a variety of American engagements in the kingdom that are driven by the priorities of Saudis and that are responsive to the requests that they're putting forward. And in the best of worlds, we should be doing more of that.
I think we have time for one more question if there is. Yes, sir.
I'm Mohammed Al-Sudairi from Saudi Arabia. I'm sorry about my language. No, I can't speak English. If you can translate, Ustad Jamal, Ustad Hala. السلام عليكم. أنا حمد السديري من السعودية. أنا أحب في الذاكرة القصيرة أنقل لكم الشيء اللي صار مع الأمير محمد بن سلمان في المقابلة الشخصية مع القناة الأمريكية. قال أنا شخص ثري وأنا أملك العديد من مساحات الأراضي، وهو بالحقيقة ما يملك إلا طابعة، يعني طابعة يطبعها ويستند عليها في بيع الأراضي هذه ويحصل الأموال اللي جابت له الثراء هذا. الحملة حقت الفساد اللي صارت، الكل مننا يؤمن في محاربة الفساد، لكن الشعب البسيط اللي في السعودية عارف انه فيه شركات عالمية متورطة بالفساد هذه. لم تذكر الشركات هذه، لا لم أحد يتطرق لها. في التدريس عندنا في السعودية، بالمناسبة أنا بنفس السنة اللي انولد فيها محمد بن سلمان 1986. والتدريس عندنا في 11 سبتمبر كانوا يوزعون الكيك والبيبسي بالفصل. فمن المدرسة حقتي مدرسة الملك عبد العزيز آل سعود في القاعدة الجوية في منطقة الظهران، مدرسة حكومية مش أهلية. مين اللي كان يتولى قيادة المدرسة هذه والتوجه هذا؟ هل هو كان الأخوان؟ هل إحنا تحت سيطرة دولة ثانية؟
إيش السؤال معليش حمد عشان الوقت؟
السؤال هذا إنه إذا كان الاجتماع هذا إنه في مساعدة، إيش المساعدة اللي إحنا نرجيها؟
Okay, so Hamad was saying that in the interview of Mohammed bin Salman, he mentioned in the 60 Minutes, he mentioned, when questioned about his personal wealth, that he is a rich person when he is not really entitled to this wealth, and he taps on his own experience as someone who worked with international companies who were partners with the Saudi companies and the Saudi owners in the corruption, and it's not really discussed within the realm of the discourse basically around corruption. And he mentioned some of the experience in his childhood, being someone who was born in the same year as Mohammed bin Salman, that in 11 September, when he was in a public school in a military base, people were celebrating 11 September by basically distributing cakes. So his question is, what is the use and utility of this meeting to basically raise those concerns or address those concerns? So is it for me or Jamal, would you like to answer that?
All right. Who can help us at that? Of course, I would much rather for us, the Saudi people, to do that. The Saudi people to be to take part
and to talk about them and
in sharing the reform with Mohammed bin Salman. That is how it should be, whether Majlis al-Shura, the Saudi media. But I know this is not going to happen. I like the advice Thomas Friedman gave to the president in his memo to the president, where he suggested that the Americans should send a high-level ambassador to Saudi Arabia. I would like him to be an economist too, because that is the issue that is going to confront Saudi Arabia. So America should stay engaged. Mohammed bin Salman very much liked Donald Trump. He is probably the only leader in the world who described Donald Trump as the right leader in the right time. So if Donald Trump truly cared for Saudi Arabia and for the success of Mohammed bin Salman, he should stay engaged and should appoint an ambassador in Saudi Arabia, a reliable, strong ambassador. I was about to suggest someone like Tillerson, but nobody like Tillerson in Saudi Arabia.
I would add just one thing is to basically engage the international law, you know, or basically engage with the companies that have presence in Saudi Arabia, you know, in terms of how do they conduct business according to the international law, which I think there is some kind of corruption clauses that can be applicable to those companies, and these have been operating really in Saudi Arabia with full impunity, and not only in Saudi Arabia, but in different places as well. I've heard, you know, I was in a talk in Cambodia, and somebody was describing the resorts and everything that was, you know, built on grabbed lands, on the cost of displacing people. So I think this is a very worthy point that should be addressed by concerned citizens here in the U.S. What are the international implications of the engagement of the U.S. companies in those places? And they're told basically on the development of those countries. So
thank you.
ممكن نتكلم بعد
Thank you. I think we've unfortunately run out of time, but this has been a fascinating discussion. Again, thank you to the panelists and to those who attended for braving the inclement weather and the harsh terrain. A recording of this segment will be online, and you can watch it after the fact. And one final plug for POMED. We recently issued a 2-page fact sheet on Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia, to coincide with this event. We have paper copies here for those of you watching online. You can go to our website and access it. But with that, thank you again, and let's give our speakers a round of applause.